Hello everyone, I am Tyler Caldwell with SmokingPipes.com, and today I get the privilege of sitting here with Mr. Mike Rosales, owner of RoMa Craft Cigars. And today we're going to give you a little bit of a history and Mike's involvement in the tobacco industry. So let's hear it.
Okay, well thank you all for having me here, and super excited to kind of give a brief rundown. Again, I'm Michael Rosales, so also known as the Ro of RoMa Craft. So RoMa Craft is basically Michael Rosales and Skip Martin. So Ro and Ma, the first two letters of the last name. So
I never realized that.
Yeah, that's the reason why the M is capital. Most people will kind of skip that and just But yeah, so we started the company. Kind of started working on the whole project in 2010. At the time. So, I basically, my background was in real estate. I was doing real estate development kind of stuff, and got partnered up with some people in Costa Rica working on a project, and then met some rollers that were making cigars, and really just kind of tapped in with them. And I was not a cigar smoker, like a heavy. I was not in the industry at all. I was just a casual person, and so I started buying cigars and giving them as gifts to people who came and kind of visited the project we were working on. And then their son wanted to work on his English and wanted to come to the States, and he could make cigars. So I reached out to a local cigar shop in Austin, asked them if they'd be interested in bringing in a roller and sponsoring them. So I imported some tobacco and sponsored his visa, got him working in the States. And then that led into 3 or 4 other rollers all across Texas. And then during that time, my partner, Skip Martin, was working with Dell. So he did mergers and acquisitions and global operations for Dell, and but was a heavy cigar smoker. And so we kind of ran the same circles. And he had invested into a cigar shop in Galveston, and eventually ended up kind of taking it over. And it had built a nice little business kind of on the side. And it got hit by a hurricane. So I want to say in 2008, it got hit by Hurricane Ike. And so, he was kind of looking at, does he open up another cigar shop, or does he go into making a brand, or, really kind of trying to find himself in another investment opportunity. And, so anyway, so we he had brought over some cigars that he was getting from Christian. So back in the day, whenever he had a cigar shop, he would take consumers, down to a Christian shop before they sold to Davidoff, and kind of like what people have done with the Lost and Found. He would kind of buy some either abandoned projects or cigars that he thought was really good, and he had kind of this escaparate in his humidor, and some different price points.
Sure. But
there was one particular that he really liked, and he had a handful left, and he brought them over to us and asked if we could make something like that. And and the tobacco that we had in the States was not nearly heavy enough or dark enough or rich enough. So we took them apart, and Raul's like, we don't have anything here, but my brother Esteban, who was running Scandinavia at the time, could help you with that. So we started working on basically what became the CroMagnon.
Okay.
And so that was late 2010, and so the cool thing about Skip was he had a huge following on Twitter, because back then, you didn't have, Facebook and Instagram and stuff like that. Back, I want to say it was like MySpace and Twitter were the only ones that were, kind of available. And so, but he had a huge following because, the people that would come into Galveston would usually through the cruise ships, and so he would sign up for kind of like their news offering. And so he had a huge following on Twitter. And so he was basically kind of highlighting and taking pictures and just kind of talking about the process of making the cigar itself. And once we kind of finalized it, guys were hitting him up saying, hey, sell me a $5. And so, I'd get on the phone and I would call people and get their credit cards, and his kids were over there, stuffing envelopes of cigars, and we were mailing them out. And we were doing like 5,000 cigars a month, just all through mail order. And so then eventually a lot of cigar shops that were carrying or working with me through the rollers were like, hey, I'm starting to hear some buzz about this cigar, and would you sell it to us? And I'm like, well, I don't know. It's not really my cigar. It's a project that I'm helping out with, but it's really, it's Skip's cigar. And long story short, I went to him and said, hey, I think we could actually scale this. And so in January 2011, February, March, and then May, we were doing about 5,000 cigars a month, all through mail order. And then we get a phone call from Esteban saying there's no more broadleaf. And so, Skip's like, well, just go buy some. How much you need? And it's like, well, it doesn't really work that way.
You find out it's not that easy.
Yeah. So he's like, well, so he was friendly with Jonathan Drew. And so actually that year in 2011, we go down to Nicaragua. And at the same time, the Nicaraguan Tobacco Festival was going on. So we went over and we met with Gustavo Cura. And Gustavo was like, yeah, I got broadleaf. Shows us all the broadleaf. And so we end up, buying, I want to say it's like 350 pounds of broadleaf. And he's okay. So then he's like, well, I also have this other stuff. And so we start looking at some Habano wrapper. And the idea is that, obviously if CroMagnon wasn't going to be available all the time, or the broadleaf for CroMagnon, then we wanted to have a backup, which was the Habano version, same blend, just different wrappers. And but it's a Ligero priming, so it's a heavier, thicker wrapper leaf. And so we bought like 500 pounds of that. And so, during this time, it's like, we're trying to figure, like, we hadn't really created a company. We really hadn't really, it was like Skip's project, but yet we kind of jointly ventured on this, big tobacco purchase. Because we also bought some Arapiraca, which was the Brazilian that you had in your hand, and then we blended up the Connecticut, which was the cigar that I had smoked. And so Skip's like, okay, great, when can we start making cigars? And so he goes, well, you probably another 13, 14 months, because you got to go through all the fermentation process, sure. Right? So this stuff was early on, and so by default, it was like, okay, well, we have to figure out what we can make to continue to make cigars. And so we came up with the Intemperance brands, which was the EC and the BA, and which was, kind of this thought process that would, tobaccos that would always be available. We could make cigars, at least with those types of wrappers. And so anyways, long story short, they're like, so the idea that was we would launch at the next following year's trade show.
Okay.
So all that tobacco kind of goes into fermentation. We decided to build out the small factory, which was behind Esteban's house. And then, so we started making, small production runs, and so Esteban worked for another factory. And then at nighttime, he would come over and they would make cigars in the back of his house. And so he would hand select, some of his buddies to come over and make cigars. And if you kind of imagine, like in the back of your home or in a house, he had this long patio that was probably, I don't know, maybe like 25 in width and maybe about like 50, 60 feet in depth. So we enclosed that, and then we put, pears down the side, put little cabinets around the edges. And, in his garage, he had like a tandem garage. And so that's where they would do all the drying and curing of the tobacco. And so, his poor family, they had tobacco coming out, every directions. And that was very temporary. And so during that time, we started looking at a space. And so we ended up finding a place in downtown Esteli, which is now called Nica Sueño. And so we opened that up in 2013, at the beginning of 2013. And then it's just been off to the races ever since.
Sure thing.
So
you guys are making small amount of cigars for a small amount of clientele, and then next thing you know, you're just jumping right into full board manufacturing. I've always felt like RoMa Craft has had such a very unique, different view of your characteristics of how you make your cigars with your manufacturing processes. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so as a whole, I think, I look back at, kind of when Skip and I kind of really started, looking at a lot of companies jump out in, like, it's really easy to go to Nicaragua and say, hey, I want to make a cigar line. And back in the day, you could walk into Plasencia, you could walk into any kind of factory and say, hey, I want to, how much would it take for me to create my own cigar? And, if you drop down, X amount of money and, go over to the box factory, design your box and, call a band company, do your bands and labels, you could easily, get your product line started relatively in our industry as a whole. However, kind of, I've been in this industry since 2006. So you've seen a lot of guys come and go, right? Like they jump out there, they really take off, and it's really easy. Like you say, okay, I need 500 boxes of Toros, I need 500 boxes of Robustos, I want 500 boxes of some kind of Corona, and maybe a Churchill, right? And what ends up happening is the thought process is really simple. It's like, I make a cigar, and then I'm going to go knock on doors and say, hey, you sell cigars, will you sell my product? And so getting on the shelf is really easy. Like you go in, you establish a relationship, you're like, hey, let's smoke the cigars, hey, we'll give it a shot from a retail perspective. They put it on the shelves, and then you within 30 days, you ask guys to try to smoke the cigars, they smoke it, but do they come back and then buy it again and again and again? Because, you don't really establish yourself until you get the third, fourth, fifth order.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Yeah. And so, so a couple things were, with that in mind, the conversation piece is how do you get the consumer engagement to where they come to the retailer and they ask for that product, right? Because then that's half the battle, right? So if you can get the engagement of like hardcore cigar smokers that smoke 5 or 6 cigars a day that come in and ask the retail to help, this is the cigar that I'm looking for, can you get it, keep it, in stock, and I'll buy it, right? So, and in the same kind of token, it's, so how do you find a retailer that is a good retailer that understands the consumer demand, that listens to the consumer, as well as has a good enough relationship with the manufacturer that, either doesn't beat you up for deals, doesn't beat you up for terms, doesn't beat you up for, all the things that so I'll give you a really good, example how that works. So let's say I walk into your shop, you don't know me from Adam, and I come in, I go, hey, I just started, I'm Don Julio Cigar Company. And, I got my cool hat, right? And, and my Rico Suave kind of whatever. And you smoke the cigars, you know what? I'll give it a shot, but I'm going to need 30 days. And that 30 days, to pay becomes a 30, 60, 90 ride you kind of situation. Or, I'm going to buy it, but I also want X amount of discounts and I want, standing or whatever. And so it puts you kind of in this disadvantage because you're like, I got 500 boxes of these 4 different sizes, and you're thinking, yeah, absolutely, like let's go, like I finally am on the shelf, so I'm up and running, like, and that's just a fraction of the battle, right? So, on top of manufacturing delays, box delays, all the the vistas and labels and stuff that has to there's just an influx of things that can go wrong, complications, importations, the duties and taxes that have to be paid, right? So it's so again, this part over here is really easy. Having a manufacturer make the cigars part is easy, right? But can you get the boxes on time? Can you get the labels on time? Can you get them imported in? And you have all this cost up front that has to go into making the product. And then for you to, then try to get the money back in so that way it can kind of flow through is very difficult. And it's a longer thing. So what ends up happening is those 500 boxes, sure, the Toros might sell a little bit faster, but your depletion rate is not evenly distributed across the board. Meaning you might sell through your Toros really fast, you might sell through your Robustos really fast, but then you still have 490 boxes of the Coronas, right? And you may still only have, you still have a certain amount of the Churchills. And so it's a very complicated kind of equation. And so taking all that into consideration is like, okay, well, how do you, again, get consumer demand, right? With customer outreach and engagement and really tapping into what do the consumers want to smoke. And and bringing that in to the whole kind of operation, like into your philosophy, into your DNA, like what separates you from, because you go into any humidor and there's 1,700 different SKUs, right? And they're all a quarter inch apart from the next brand, right? And they all look the same, So RoMa Craft is always kind of taking this approach. It's like, okay, we make cigars for people who want to smoke a lot of cigars, and we, on purpose, have always tried to be in this kind of $7 to $12 MSRP, because the guys who smoke 5 or 6 cigars a day, like if I had to add up like how much I smoked on a daily basis, I'm smoking 5 to 7 cigars a day, right? So at $10, you're talking $70, $80 just at retail
a day,
right? A day. And again, it's not because I have to have a cigar. It's because I enjoy conversations like this, right? So, I'm blessed that I get to do this all across the world. And so the challenge then, so if kind of like what you want to do to the consumer engagement, working backwards, and say, okay, I want to be in this price point, but I want to use heavier, thicker types tobacco. I want to use tobaccos that are unique and a little bit rarer, people don't use. And I give a really good example. When we decided to use the broadleaf in the Cameroon, people thought we were nuts, because you have some of the most expensive wrapper, binder, just in the cigar, right? In the Brazilian, we were doing the Brazilian Indonesian. A lot of people don't like using Arapidaca, especially on a natural, because it's what we call, it's hydroscopic. So it releases and consumes humidity at the same rate, right? So you can get, splits and tears in the wrapper leaf. So, but at the same time, when we kind of came up, was kind of part of, in the middle of kind of the craft, beer kind of boom, right? When, Jester King was doing, open fermentation in different variants and bottles, right? To kind of see like what the expression would be in the bottles. And so we thought that was fascinating. So you have to kind of, okay, this is what you want to do. Can you work backwards and say, can we, with the available types of tobacco, can you kind of do this at a price point, but then get the consumers involved to say, hey, that sounds exciting to me. And when they come back and they buy it over and over and over again.
Sure.
Right. So very complicated, but because there's a lot of moving parts into all that stuff, right? So I don't know if that answers your question. So, that's the DNA.
Yeah.
That's like, hey, this is what we want to do. This is what we're striving to do day in and day out. And so at the time, to get into manufacturing, we felt like, it's really easy for the traditional manufacturers to make cigars that weren't really tapped into what the consumers were looking for. And so we were the conduit to the retailer, a conduit to the consumer, and try to make them connected.
Sure.
Right. So by having this kind of social media presence that allows people to interact with us directly, and then put out a product that they would find would be really kind of interesting at a price point that they felt that they could afford, then that's where, we felt like on the manufacturing side with the business analytical side that Skip kind of brought to the table, that we could basically bring it all together. Right. And that was kind of the reason why we kind of got into the manufacturing stuff. It's not easy. It is absolutely not easy. I mean, because Mother Nature is funny sometimes. Again, we've had to pivot. We were talking about the broadleaf. Broadleaf was not available in 2011, or whenever we first started doing it, 2018, and then again, here in 2022, broadleaf was just not good, or as accessible, and so we've had to pivot. And now we're doing the Pennsylvania broadleaf, right? So. Now, the cool thing about what we do versus like a larger company, like if we came in and we blended the cigar and said, hey, we just came in and we made this, high texture tobacco, extremely well fermented, there's a bean counter over in the corner that says, okay, well, how much wrapper leaf and what's the cost based on, how much did we pay for it? How much was the binder? How much was the filler? How many could you make? And And if you're a massive company, our limited production runs are usually, if it's an annual drop, maybe in that 2,000 boxes. Some of the more rare stuff that we do, maybe like it's 300 to 500 boxes, like Fomorian or Black Irish or Sabertooth or something like that. Which is kind of a joke to a larger company because they've got 3,000 accounts in the United States to service, where we have 350. You know what I mean? So anyway, so they may look at it and go, okay, well, based on how much you want to put that out at MSRP versus how much we have into it, the numbers don't add up, right? So our company, we don't have any active sales reps that are out on the road. Everything is done kind of in-house through Austin, and that's how we're able to keep our price points down, right? So if I had to pay you to go travel around and hit shops,
you would have to pay me a lot.
And you think about it. I mean, an average hotel nowadays is about $140 a night, $135 a night, right? On top of your car expenses and food and allowances or whatever. And and again, so like for me, you kind of look at it from an economic perspective. You say, okay, hey, if the Carolinas is your territory, if I had to fly out and visit some shops, and hopefully you have to cover your costs, right? So how much do you have to sell on top of your time away from being at your work, right? So anyway, so there's a lot of these complicated things. So we try to take all that stuff out and say, okay, how can we do this in a way that allows us to offer a fair price for a very, very good cigar that would rival anything in the $15 to $25 kind of price point that's really $12 or $10 to $12.
Yeah.
So that's but we control all of that. The only thing that we don't control is we don't grow our own tobacco, right? But if you buy right, and you can, and I think that's where the magic really happens at, is to look at the tobacco and go, hey, this is where I think it will be in 7, 8, 12, 13, 14 months or 2 years down the road. If you can do that well, then you can mitigate a lot of your risk.
So you mentioned that you limit yourself to 350 accounts. I'm assuming that's because you limit to how many cigars you make every year?
Yeah, so we have been at the 1.2 million. So in the factory, we have about 72-ish people that work in the factory, right? So a lot of that's accounting, packaging, material preparation, and then we have 12 pairs, which are 24 people, and they make about 350 cigars a day, right?
Sure.
So mathematically, really what it comes down to is you have a certain amount of raw goods, and the raw goods as it is being made is now being changed from raw goods to finished goods, right? So what you want to try to do is, you look at, okay, so let's say, for example, in 2018, we bought a lot of the broadleaf that was available that we could afford to buy, and you kind of stockpile it. So you look at it and go, okay, how many of those, like we look at what's called yields. So yields are how many pounds per 1,000 would it take to make 1,000 cigars?
Okay.
Right. So to kind of give you kind of some easy numbers, Connecticut shade wrapper, if it's good, high quality, it may be, 12 pounds per 1,000 at $21 to $24 a pound, depending on how clean and how shiny and the elasticity that it has. Arapiraca, when we first started making Arapiraca in the Brazilian, it was $19 a pound, and then they started using the euro in Brazil, and then it jumped to $28, $29 a pound.
That's
right?
a big jump.
So it's a huge jump. And then it was like more of like 14 pounds, 15 pounds per 1,000. Because we make a lot of smaller cigars, and so realistically, so you have your tobacco leaf that's like this, right? You take the vein out, so you have two leaves. So you have the left and the right? You turn this sideways. You start looking at the cuts, right? So you've got some of the edges over the time that are too crinkled. You can't use that. So you have to kind of trim the bottom. And this is where it gets really interesting, right? So if you said, okay, I could make a lot of Toros per se, but if that wrapper leaf cost me, so let's say, for example, I'm paying for broadleaf, I'm paying $38 a pound, and I need 16 pounds per 1,000, or even 18 pounds per 1,000, depending on how well it fermented and how good a shape that tobacco is in after this long process of going through fermentation. What ends up happening is I look at it, or we look at it and go, okay, hey, if I can make a 5x50 Robusto or a 5x56 Robusto, cut it in half. So for example, mathematically, if it's $36 a pound and I need 16 pounds per 1,000, you may say, okay, that's 85 cents in a Toro. Or I can cut it in half and I can do two 5x56s and get two different cigars out of that same side of that tobacco leaf, or a 5x56 and a 4x52, right? I can up my production in getting more of that type of wrapper leaf on that cigar, and I can get the cost down to 35 to 40 cents, which allows me to sell the cigar at a lower price point at the retail level.
And it helps keep your cigars at a consistent level also.
Sure. But then I can pack that sumbitch full of, $7, $8, $9, $10 really good fermented filler leaf, make it burn slower, right? And feel like I'm giving the consumer a better value. And again, right? So I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, the wrapper leaf is that's what they see, but it's also the bulk of the cost, right? And as far as like the actual, the production of the cigar, I mean, the wrapper leaf is the most expensive part. So so going back to, hey, so in 2018 when we bought all this tobacco, you may say, okay, hey, based on our yields, how many could we make in 2018, 2019, 2020? And you said, okay, hey, if we're going to make 1 million, let's do 250,000 CroMagnons, right? And that allows us to kind of eat a little bit of that over a period of time until we exhaust it all.
Sure.
And then also put a value out into the marketplace that people that like that type of wrapper leaf, that enjoy that experience, but then, getting the retailer to educate, as well as us, right, to educate like, hey, this cigar may not be a 660 or 770, because that seems to be like the trend right now. However, that cigar is so fully packed of really good tobacco that it will last as long as your bigger cigar, right? And that's a hurdle, right? Like that's a hurdle from a sales perspective. But at the end of the day, that's what we try to do is, and so you look at, okay, we're making 1 million, how many of the Connecticut's can you make? How many of the Brazilians can you make? How many of the Bacas, Aquitaine and CroMagnon, right? That make up that 1.2 million. So about 1 million cigars are imported into the States, and about 250,000 go to Europe. So, and that's kind of the level that we've kind of stayed at, because at the end of the day, it's easier to control from a quality perspective. It's easier to control from a level of your cost, as far as making sure that you have the accessible types of tobacco to maintain that on a year in, year out basis. And so if you know that you're kind of capped at limit, space is a big deal too, right? So whenever you have this type of again, you got Palones working. You have, the daily tobacco stuff that they're using every day, the cigars that you have to, once they house them. So we age, all our thicker tobaccos 16 weeks. So if we made a cigar January 1, week 1 of the year, that cigar would stay in for 16 weeks in aging. So we've always used like this philosophy of like low and slow, like barbecue. Mm-hmm. I'm from Austin, Texas. So everything is like, hey, if you sell out, you sell out. If barbecue, they'll come out and they'll go, hey, you can stand in line at 11, but by 12:30, all the brisket's gone. Sorry, we got sausage and I've got chopped beef or I've got ribs, and then at 1 o'clock, that's all done. They close the sign up and that's it, right? So, but that's how like for us anyways, if a barbecue joint is really good, is based on how quickly they sell out.
Sure.
Right? So that being low and slow, controlled in a very methodical pace that we can kind of control, allows for excellent quality, right? Because you can kind of understand like what's being made. You understand like there's no pressure. Like we're not mass volume, right? And that's where the craft aspect kind of comes into the name RoMa Craft Tobacco. Is we're not the mass market. Let's bang out 80 million cigars next year.
Sure.
Like that's just not us, right? But it also becomes we use higher, thicker primings in tobacco, and again, So your tobacco plant, think of it like a Christmas tree. The thicker, heavier stuff's going to be at the corona, the top part of the plant. Well, that's only so big. There's only so much of that other part. So, again, kind of going back to the bigger companies, if we had a limited edition, we said, hey, we're using this Corona Crown, they're going to look at how much do you have in inventory of that, and they're going to say, well, why don't we go down here to the fatter part of the plant? There's a lot more of that part that we can use, and this is going to be a lot cheaper than this other part. So if we substitute this for that, we can make a lot more, right? But then is it limited, or is it rare? Is it special?
Sure.
Is it what makes it unique at that point? It's just another cigar using kind of this mediocre, not to say that it's bad tobacco, it's just, is it exceptional tobacco?
It's not quite top shelf like the...
Yeah. So, and that's kind of and again, that's what kind of separates us from a lot of other people. Like we didn't invent making cigars. We didn't invent, the whole cigar process, but we're disciplined enough to do it the right way, the way that we think that consumers want it to enjoy it.
Very interesting. So you touched on a couple names of blends that you guys produce. So let's go into a little bit about those, like each and every one, if you don't mind. We know that you started with the CroMagnon, and then you eased your way into the Habano with the Aquitaine. Mm-hmm. What was next after the Aquitaine?
Well, so you had the Intemperance brands, and the Intemperance brands are designed to be $6.50 to $10 high quality value cigar.
Sure.
That you can smoke. And what's really interesting is, so we started off with the 4 lines. So you had the Intemperance Ecuador, Connecticut, which had Indonesian binder, Nicaraguan, and Dominican, as well as the Brazilian Arapiraca, which is like a Maduro, that is also Indonesian, Nicaraguan, and Dominican. Different filler leaves inside the blend. However, the price point at the time when we kind of launched, this is 2011, was kind of in that $6.50 to $8 price point, maybe $9. Now you're kind of in that $7 to $10
Sure.
price point with kind of inflation stuff. And so we recently have added Whiskey Rebellion, which came, I think, in 2017, which is a Habano wrapper, more like a Rosado kind of, sure. Actually, what I'm smoking now. And then recently, last year at the trade show, we launched the Volstead, which is Sumatra blend, which is what you're smoking. And
my personal favorite. And
so the concept in this portfolio was, one, it's a prohibition piece. So when we started, Skip and I sat down and we're kind of talking about, okay, what are some of the things that as you kind of start to launch a company, what are going to be some of the things that you're going to run up against that are going to hurt challenges?
Sure.
Right? And so obviously the retailer relationship was number one that we kind of talked about. Picking guys that could hand sell, that could understand, like, oh, hey, you like that cigar, let me show you this, and cross sell over into, like, I know this is in your wheelhouse, mm-hmm. like, you're gonna love the cigar, right? And picking those types of retailers that hand sold, that knew the consumer base, and had relationships with them. That was number one. The second thing was, okay, the FDA, and at that point it wasn't even FDA, it was just more of government in general, right? So state regulations, being able to smoke, smoking bans, tobacco taxes. Because when I started in 2006, S-chip was recently passed, which added the 42.5 cents at the importation level. And then you have each different state has its own different types of regulations, right? And so, and then the federal government, so understanding like that was going to be a bigger challenge and obstacle because it was kind of unknown, we kind of created the Intemperance brands, right? So you were either temperate or you're intemperate, so you either abstained or you took part, and that was the prohibition propaganda stuff that they used to start the 18th Amendment. So you have the Ecuadorian Connecticut 18th Amendment, mm-hmm. and you have the ECBA for the 21st Amendment, which was the repeal.
Okay.
Right. So in the tree of intemperance, for anyone who wants to Google that, there's a tree, and one side of the tree is vibrant and alive, and it's growing, and it looks, it's doing what a tree should do, and on the other side of it, it's dying, right? So you have the before and after. So if you drank, then you would die and your seeds would be bad, and that. And then the other side was vibrant. So if you abstained, like you would just be healthy and your seeds would be healthy, and so that was kind of the propaganda stuff that they used to kind of get prohibition started. And so we took the tree of temperance, put our spin on it. So you have the church and state, because you had a lot of stuff kind of going on in that early 20s era, and so but it was also this idea that if people didn't get involved, that we would basically kind of repeat what we've gone through with alcohol, right? And so the Whiskey Rebellion is a timepiece. George Washington rolled on the people. They were trying to get the corn growers in Pennsylvania to pay taxes. They didn't want to pay taxes, and so that Whiskey Rebellion was an event in time. And so all the names of the cigars, like in the Volstead, basically are timepiece or relevant. So instead of calling it a Toro or a Robusto, it's the Roy Olmsted.
Sure.
Right? Or, it's George Remus, right? So if you know the story about George Remus, he was a government guy, but also had, during that time they allowed you to, if you had the right permits, you could make medicinal alcohol, but he was also bootlegging in the back door, right? There's speakeasies, we have the Blind Pig, so cool names that kind of tie into the cigars, right? And so the Intemperance brands comes with 4 different wrappers. So you have the Connecticut Shade, the Brazilian Maduro, you have the Habano, and you have the Sumatra, which is the Ecuadorian hybrid, right? So Cameroon seed, grown in Ecuador, delicious wrapper, and it's all of these cigars are basically that mild to medium without going over the top. And so that's kind of the portfolio for the Intemperance brands. $7 to $10 all day long. Yeah. Smoke them, and they're fantastic smokes, right? Yeah. Then you have kind of the next level up as far as body and strength, which is CroMagnon, Aquitaine, Neanderthal. And then we kind of throw in Baca. Baca is not really like a heavy as far as kick you in the nuts kind of smoke, but it's more of a traditional throwback to what a Cameroon cigar, lots of flavor, more kind of that just straight medium kind of complexity. But CroMagnon, the original, which was had the U.S. Connecticut broadleaf, Cameroon binder, Nicaraguan filler, and then you had the Aquitaine, same blend, which was the CroMagnon, or I'm sorry, you had the Habano, Ligero, Cameroon, and Nicaraguan filler. And then recently at this year's trade show, we've just launched the new CroMagnon Pennsylvania, which is a Pennsylvania broadleaf wrapper. We use the Sumatra binder that doesn't yield off in that. And then we have a Nicaraguan Dominican fill in that one as well. So then you have Neanderthal, which is a Mexican San Andres, full-bodied, double Ligero, Pennsylvania in it. You guys sell a ton of it, so it does really well. So and that's kind of the lineup. It's but again, everything that we make, with the exception of Baca, and we don't really make a lot of Baca because Cameroon wrapper right now is probably $72 a pound, right? And the only thing consistent about Cameroon wrapper is that it's inconsistent as far as color, shade, texture, and thickness. Sure. So when you lay them all out, if you said, okay, hey, here's heavy, dark, rich, here's large wrapper leaf, here's your medium, and here's your small. You might have, large but a lighter, an extra light. You know what I mean? So you have more, instead of saying hey, it's not very linear. It's more like this as far as what you get, right? So you it's really hard to look at and go, hey, what are your yields on that? Because you don't have, and you could buy 25,000 pounds to make, but you're only going to use 4,000 or 5,000 out of it. It's so it makes it really, really difficult. But that's what makes it so great, because it's so unique. But like the Mexican San Andres, that's been for the Neanderthal. It's got the flat, cap. The Neanderthal had the flat forehead. Aquitaine is the region of France where they found the Cro-Magnon skull. Okay. Right. So you have. We have all this, so you've got, 5 core line sizes, or 6 actually. So you have the Pestera Mulier, which is the cave, you have Knuckle Dragger, Mandible, Mode 5, Anthropology, Cranium. I think that's it. So there's 6 sizes in the core line sizes, in both the CroMagnon and an Aquitaine, and now the Pennsylvania. Neanderthal has 3 core line sizes, which is the HN, the SGP, and the Hox D. And so, yeah, I mean, it's crazy to think, because we started off, we only had like these 4 different brands, and you know, these so many different sizes, and now you look at the portfolio, we make all these kind of one-off wonky sizes that are kind of fun and cool to make. So, but yeah.
So that is RoMa Craft, and I gotta say, I've been a fan since the beginning. Anyone who knows me knows I'm a huge cigar nerd. I'm always trying to find the next big cool cigar that, you know, I see a future in. RoMa Craft has turned me onto more of a cigar nerd over the years, and you know, I just want to say thank you for all the cigars you guys do make, and thank you for coming here today and discussing it with us.
No problem. We'll keep some nuggets for our next video.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks for having me on, guys.
That's right. And make sure you guys at home or on your phone or wherever you are with internet access to watch this, make sure you check us out, smokingpipes.com. Go up there, click on RoMa Craft. You're going to find quite a large portfolio available. Highly suggest getting at least 1 box of everything, because you're going to want them once you get it.